In this presentation, we are going to explore the history of geopolitics as a concept. We'll look at the origins of the concept and how it evolved over time. So our primary objective here is to see how this concept evolved from its origins and throughout the 20th century, primarily beginning as a subdiscipline of geography, but gradually other schools and theories of geopolitics were developed. And we will look at all these interactions, especially the interaction between imperialism and geography, because that is the most important historical context. So the historical background here is quite important because geopolitics emerged after this long 19th century, so to say, which was the high age of empire. Now, the prelude to this was that Napoleon had just been defeated in France, and the major powers of Europe had convened at the Congress of Vienna to launch what was known as the Concert of Europe. Now, this was to be the beginning of a new kind of international system, towards the end of which geopolitics emerged as a discipline, looking back at this century of the Concert of Europe and the high age of empire. Now, this Concert of Europe was the launching of a new international system in the system of states of Europe, but this was also an age of expansion in which Europe began to conquer colonies across the world, so had implications for all the other major nations of the world as well. But towards the end of the system, there was a phase of war, especially between France and Prussia. And it was this point of time that a new unified Germany began to emerge on the political map of Europe and affect the political geography and the distribution of power in Europe. And this new player in the game of geopolitics, so to say, in the German Empire, began to think of its role not just in Europe but also on the global stage. So the other important moment was the Berlin Conference, and this conference in a sense was convened to discuss Germany's relationship with the rest of the world, and this is also seen in a sense as the beginning of the scramble for Africa, which was this last remaining uncontested space in which empires could compete. But there was also important context to this. There were intellectual currents going on in Europe at the time, which defined Europe's relationship, or which sought to define Europe's relationship with the world. And the primary intellectual tradition here is that of social Darwinism, and this fundamental idea that natural selection should also determine geopolitics and the relations of nations amongst each other, and this idea that strong powers should dominate and the weak should give way to the strong. It was in this context that geopolitics emerged, and the first two important thinkers that we'll look at here are Rudolf Kjellen and Friedrich Ratzel. The term geopolitics was coined by Kjellen, who was a Swedish political geographer, and he coined this term in 1917. And he derived this term from Friedrich Ratzel's book on political geography. Now, Ratzel in this book had primarily focused on this idea, which was again emerging at the time, what you might call the organic theory of the state. And this built right into his interpretation of how political geography was affected by the currents of social Darwinism. So let's just get into this. So there were some fundamental ideas which motivated Ratzel, and this was the idea that every state society is rooted in its own geography, and it grows in its own geography through a process of adaptation, which in turn leads to population growth. And this population growth then shows that the society is well adapted, and it necessitates expansion, because this is a well adapted society, so it is a strong society, and it should expand into larger and larger realms of living space, and it should do so at the cost of other weaker states. So let us look at the outlines of Kjellen's theory, which of course he based on Ratzel's work. So these are some fundamental components of the theory, and it follows a logical progression. So a people or a folk inhabits its space or room or realm, and when this folk is successfully adapted to its realm or its space, it grows its population and develops a great culture. Both are important. The population growth is important only if this great people have a great culture and build a great society. And these two then necessitate expansion of this great society or this great culture into more and more living space. And this is a right of these people who have this great culture. And this was then adapted by Karl Haushofer, who was a theoretician of geopolitics in Nazi Germany. And you might recognize these words then if you are aware of the history of the era. This became a justification for the expansion of the regime. Now, built into this idea of geopolitics is a sense of geographic determinism. And this idea of geographic determinism was also used by other theoreticians in slightly different ways. And we turn now, of course, to Halford Mackinder. So Halford Mackinder was, of course, British, and you might recognize him from this dictum, or which is, in a sense, the slogan of geopolitics: who rules East Europe commands the heartland, and whoever rules the heartland commands the world island. So you see, again, there is a sense of geographic determinism and even historical determinism now built into this idea of geopolitics. And let us look at the theoretical outline of Halford Mackinder's work. Now, there is a sort of simplicity to Halford Mackinder's theory, and this is something that people find really appealing when they approach his work. But within this simplicity, there is also a deeper logic, a theoretical system that he has built. There is an idea of clash of civilizations that you might see built into Halford Mackinder's theory. He speaks about barbarians and external barbarism and how it is constantly at war with settled and civilized spaces. In that, he shares certain assumptions of the German school of geopolitics, but there is also a more systemic approach hidden in his work, which has to be drawn out. Now, this is under the rubric of what we might call the geostrategy, geotechnology, and geoeconomics nexus. Now, these are not terms which Halford Mackinder invented or even used, or perhaps even anticipated. These have become more relevant in our times, but the theoretical core is in Halford Mackinder's work. And I have tried to draw it out in more detail in my other presentations, two of which are on Caspian Report and a third one is here. But I'll just give you a sense or a brief idea of what Halford Mackinder's systemic approach to geopolitics is. So Halford Mackinder's approach to understanding world history was primarily systemic. He saw different regions of the world interacting with each other primarily through military force. And in his reading of history, he saw different cultures developing their capacities for projecting power and using that power to dominate other regions. And in this especially, he focused on the role of Central Asia as a zone which created or which nurtured these nomad barbarians who threatened the civilized fringes of the Eurasian megacontinent, especially in Europe, but also in the other zones such as India and China. And in his times, he saw a new phase in world history where technological growth had changed the dynamics. Initially, the development of naval power by the fringes of the Eurasian megacontinent, especially the peninsulas in Europe, had changed the dynamic and began to encroach upon land power in the heartland of Eurasia and had contained the nomad barbarians. But now, with the new technological element of railways, a new Central Asian power, which was Russia, which had won in a sense the great game and which now commanded all the resources of Central Asia, was in a position to once again flip the trend. And it could use its vast railway networks in Central Asia to do so. It could use its railways to extract resources from Central Asia, and it could use them to mobilize its armies and once again strike out at the Rimland, just as the nomad barbarians had done in previous ages. So while this is his grand narrative of history, there is also a structural element that we can look at. And this is what we might call the geoeconomics and geostrategy nexus, which ultimately builds up towards geopolitical power. And of course, geotechnology is an important element here. So in our understanding of Halford Mackinder, the geotechnological aspect of railways might be utilized to extract geoeconomic resources and might be used to project geostrategic power on key zones in the Eurasian megacontinent. And once again, this is what we draw out from our understanding of the grand narrative that he projected. And once again, I discussed this in a lot of detail in my other lectures which I referenced. But now let's move on and discuss the next important thinker. So now we move on to our next thinker, and this is Alfred Mahan, and he wrote an important book called The Influence of Sea Power on History, and this was published in 1890. So let's just look at the core elements of his theory. Mahan emphasized what we might call the human dimension of geopolitics in addition to the geotechnological dimension. So he said that to build their national power, nations should invest in modern fleets, and they should also invest in the training of efficient crews to man those fleets. So this is the geotechnological and the human aspect of geopolitical power. And then nations should develop strategies to target their enemy shipping. That is by scaling your own power upwards and by targeting your enemy's power and trying to limit his power, you then take control of this important dimension of oceanic space, which again, even at his time, was important for geoeconomic power, for the movement of commerce. So if you could use again this nexus of using geotechnological power with its human dimension to gain a geoeconomic edge by controlling choke points, especially through which trade flowed, then you could control the imperial distribution of power on a grand global space. Because again, remember, oceans are the biggest stage on the surface of the earth. And then, of course, in the two world wars, we see an emerging intersection of all these different geopolitical theories. Now, in the lead up to the First World War, many nations had begun to over-focus on Mahan's idea of developing national sea power. And in a sense, it was the escalation of competition on sea which created the conditions for warfare on land. And on land itself, there was a tremendous loss of life on the front lines as armies began to entrench themselves, and this new geotechnological dimension of industrial warfare and the added dimension of air power was something that geopolitics theoreticians had perhaps not taken into account sufficiently. Then in the Second World War, of course, we saw this geopolitical idea of Lebensraum being weaponized by the Nazi regime to justify their expansion. But again, we saw how this idea was fundamentally flawed, and the vision of the world which saw the world as a battlefield for perpetual warfare and a war of all against all could only lead to devastation on all sides and was not a roadmap for building a sustainable international order. And international order, in a sense, after the two world wars collapsed, which from our perspective also signals a failure of the geopolitical theories. What emerged in the wake of the two world wars was a new distribution of power on the global stage. Russia emerged as a strong land power commanding the Heartland, and the United States from its Pacific stage emerged as a strong naval power. And this was the new distribution of power with a third and added element of decolonization as European empires began to retreat and new actors emerged on the global stage who had very different understandings of what the world order should be. But ultimately, it was the Cold War balance of power which created this new structure of the geopolitical distribution of power between the East and the West. And while geopolitics as a word was discredited because of its association with the Nazi regime, a new way of understanding the world had to be developed, and the first thinker who attempted to understand this Cold War distribution of power was George F. Kennan, who proposed that this new power which had risen on the world stage, he was writing, of course, from the perspective of the United States, the USSR, had to be contained, and this containment could only be achieved if there was a clear signaling of spheres of influence in which each superpower would be free to exercise its own conception of world order. So these two spheres of influence commanded by these two superpowers would maintain a sort of balance of power in the world system. And there would be a tacit understanding or a sort of great game again being played between these two great powers. This, of course, was a theoretical assessment of the Cold War distribution of power, and things in international politics don't always conform to the template of theorists or theoreticians. And of course, war did break out along the edges of the Cold War, but largely the system of spheres of influence held. And after this, we move on to another important thinker who is Nicholas J. Spykman. And Spykman, in a sense, rediscovered geopolitics, which of course had been shunned by theoreticians in the West because of its associations. Or rather, we should say that he revived geopolitical thinking without using that dreaded term. So Spykman proposed that geography should be the fundamental factor in foreign policy because it is the permanent basis. It creates the stage on which nations operate. And foreign policy should understand, first of all, the realities of international relations or power politics or spheres of influence, and then taking into account geographical factors, taking into account the distribution of power in spheres of influence, a grand strategy should be developed which uses the advantages of geographical location for both war and for peace. And here again we see this idea of the geopolitics of peace being proposed. Now remember, while Mackinder had stressed the importance of land power, Mahan had spoken about the importance of sea power and naval power. And Spykman attempted to reconcile these two views. So he rephrased Mackinder's slogan for geopolitics to say that whoever controls the Rimland controls Eurasia, and whoever controls Eurasia controls the destinies of the world. And this Rimland, of course, was this arc along the Eurasian Rimland, running from the Pacific, running down into the Indian Ocean, through the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, into the Mediterranean Sea. We might think of the Rimland as the southern edge of the Eurasian megacontinent. And this is interesting because the Rimland is, in a sense, where the land and the sea meet. But in actual terms, this was also the place where the majority of the world's population lived. Of course, in China, in Southeast Asia, in India, and in Arabia, of course, you had a new important geopolitical factor, which was a geoeconomic resource, that is oil, which was the fuel that moved the engines of the world economy. And again, this Rimland is also important because along the Rimland run the most important choke points, which remember Mahan had stressed as one of the most important factors of the geostrategic zones which needed to be controlled for projection of geopolitical power. Now, in the decades that followed, and especially as the Cold War entered its middle stages, the idea and the concept of geopolitics was revived by a school of thinkers whom we might call neoclassical scholars of geopolitics. And this included Henry Kissinger, who drew on European traditions as the raison d'etat or the reason of state. And he built on traditions of statecraft from French statesmen such as Richelieu of France. And he began to study this concert of powers, and he began to apply ideas drawn from there to perhaps building a new world order based on a concert of powers between the two superpowers and other middle powers that existed at that time. And Kissinger's ideas and his understanding of world politics, in fact, shaped world politics to an extent and needs a much deeper exploration, which we will do in perhaps a future lecture or a series devoted to Kissinger's geopolitics. Another important scholar who also drew on traditions of the past, influenced by imperial traditions, especially by Lord Curzon's idea of the grand chessboard of world politics from the era of the Great Game, was Zbigniew Brzezinski. Writing in the 80s, Brzezinski applied the idea of the grand chessboard of geopolitics from the era of the Great Game to the ongoing war between the Soviets and Afghanistan. Of course, the United States was supporting the Afghan Mujahideen in their opposition to Russia at the point of time. Now, both these scholars also drew upon realist international relations theory. They stressed the importance of balance of power, and Brzezinski especially stressed on the importance of a geography-based grand strategy. This, in a sense, was again a return of the geopolitics and imperialism nexus that we spoke about earlier. So moving on, let us speak about a parallel tradition of geopolitics, which is the French Geopolitique. And this, of course, developed simultaneously in France from the 19th century, and it built on the traditions developed by Jacques-Elisée Reclus and Paul Vidal de la Blache. And these scholars were primarily working in the realm of geography and its intersections with history and also its applications to world politics. So they began primarily by investigating what we might call man-nature relationships. That is, the effects that geographical features have on human societies. And again, this was seen as a co-evolutionary adaptation of human beings to their spaces, and how this then led to emergence of different kinds of societies, which further affected the trajectory of human history. And this tradition was built on by another scholar of Geopolitik who was especially focused on the examination of power struggles, and this was Yves Lacoste, who developed in a sense the French tradition of Geopolitik. And he focused on the territorial aspects of rivalries and claims of geographical space. And one of the innovations that he introduced in geopolitics was to look at smaller and smaller scales. He began to examine even urban spaces and how geopolitics could, in a sense, unfold even in spaces as localized as streets and neighborhoods. Moving on from there towards the grand chessboard of world politics, we see how a complete and comprehensive picture of understanding the entire lived world of human experience can now be understood through these various geopolitical disciplines and themes. And finally, as we look at this map of geopolitics and the development of geopolitical theories, we should also understand that geopolitics, in a sense, is a related discipline which intersects with geography, intersects with history, and also intersects with international relations theory, which has its own schools of realism, liberalism, and other critical schools as well. So here, its idea of critical scholarship and critical social sciences also began to affect the study of geopolitics. And especially in a post-colonial context, as new nations and new actors were rising on a global stage, began to question certain assumptions about how the world was ordered. So here, critical theory began to be applied to geopolitics, and critical geopolitics focuses on the narratives and the discourse of other geopolitical traditions, and seeks to show how certain structures of power are inbuilt in the language of geopolitics of all geopolitical traditions, and how they have to be unpacked in a sense through discourse analysis to actually understand how the knowledge power nexus works. And the knowledge power nexus, again, is a term which was popularized by Foucault in France, and this began to be applied to geopolitics to understand geopolitics as a grand text which was being written on the world stage. While all of this might sound really complex, and of course it is complex because it's drawn from French social science, I like to think of critical geopolitics as essentially looking under the hood of classical geopolitics to see what is actually going on in the language and the speech and the metaphors sometimes used to describe geopolitical trajectories of nations. So finally, as we move towards the end, let us look at some of these important terms that we've covered in this entire lecture. We understood the idea of geographic space. We understood how adaptation to geographic space creates cultural spaces, or the spaces of nations or the worlds in which they live. You might refer to these spaces as their room, their lived space, or you might refer to it as their lived geographies or inhabited worlds. Then we spoke about various nexuses of geopolitics, geoeconomics, and geotechnology. We spoke about different types of stages, the texture of space, which is important. So in this, you can speak about different kinds of terrains, different elemental domains such as land and seas. You can talk about how adaptations occur in different spaces. And remember, there is a third space between the land and the sea, or the coastal regions or the rimlands where both the land and the sea interact. We haven't really spoken about the third dimension of space, which is space in the air, of course, which now, of course, in our times extends to outer space. And we also have astropolitics, or the geopolitics of outer space. And this, of course, can also extend the other way. So you might have geopolitics in the underground realm. You might have geopolitics, which is focused on the extraction of resources from the underground realm. And all of this, all of these different schools, ultimately, they coalesce into this diagram of the nexus of geopolitics, which I presented earlier, about the intersections of geopolitics, geotechnology, and geoeconomics, keeping in mind that space and scale can also be understood from a critical perspective, and we can try to understand both the lessons of history, and we can also take a critical approach towards history to try and make sense of the world. So this is a broad overview, and of course, each of these scholars and each of these sub-disciplines and sub-themes deserve not just one, but many, many presentations devoted to them. And if we have the time and the opportunity, we will do so in the future and in the many presentations that are to follow.